Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of KEN RAGGIO Live. It is Thursday night, October the 3rd, 2019. I have another prophecy news break for you. Thank you for joining me. I invite you to stay with me for the next hour. Our subject is going to be Trump against the Vatican. And I'm going to be talking about impeachment and give you something about the real story behind the impeachment. Trump against the Vatican. Impeachment, the real story. I hope you'll stay with me. Please, as we begin this program tonight, will you please click like on this timeline and make a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. Also, share this with your friends, if you will, please. If you don't already follow me on Facebook, please follow me on Facebook and Twitter and all my social networks. And also, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell for notices. Again, thank you for coming. Trump against the Vatican. Impeachment, the real story. One of the big news stories this week has to do with a raid that has taken place in the Vatican Bank. The news reports are very unspecific. They are mysterious, actually, because there's not a lot of details. I'm going to read an article here from October the 1st from the American magazine entitled Vatican Police Raid the Secretariat of State and the Finance Watchdog Offices. Vatican Police removed documents and electronic devices from the offices of the first section of the Vatican Secretariat of State. This is a big deal, folks. And the Vatican's finance control offices on October the 1st. The raids were conducted on the orders of the promoter of justice, the chief prosecutor of the Vatican city-state, and his deputy. The news was broken by the Holy See's press office in a communication to the international media hours after the morning raids. According to the Vatican statement, the raids were related to denunciations presented at the beginning of last summer by the Institute for the Works of Religion, which is more commonly known as the Vatican Bank, and by the Officer of the Auditor General. It said the denunciations related to financial operations carried out over time, without specifying the period in question. It also added that the superiors of the offices in question had been informed of the operation, but did not say if this was done before the document seizures took place. A senior Vatican source said he believed the operation, which had been authorized by Vatican prosecutors, had to do with real estate transactions. Now, I think that's all I'm going to read about that, because there's other news about this thing that I think is far more significant than the speculation that this Vatican Bank was invaded for some kind of suspicious real estate transactions. Now, I'm on this program tonight because of Bible prophecies, and I'm here because I believe we're in the last generation before the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, and I'm watching all the prophetic signs. I'm watching all the global headlines for indicators that we're in the last days. And one of the big prophecies of the last days has to do with four spirits that are going to rule the world at the time of the second coming of Jesus. Daniel chapter 7, the first two verses, talks about four spirits and four winds that will be blowing on the earth in the last days. We read in the book of Zechariah chapter 6 and Revelation chapter 6 of four horsemen, that is, four spirits that will patrol the earth in the last days. There's a white horse, a black horse, a red horse, and a green horse. We've identified those spirits. The white horse is the white horse of the Roman Catholic Church. I invite you to go back through my timeline, through my playlist on my YouTube channel, and see the video that I did, lesson 4 on the Daniel Prophecy series, is about the white horse prophecy. It's a powerful, powerful expose of the Roman Catholic Church and how it fits all these major Bible prophecies for the last days. In fact, the Catholic Church is probably the biggest subject in Bible prophecy, apart from the subject of Jesus Christ himself. And you need to know and understand how the Catholic Church fits into the last times Bible prophecies. The second horse of the four horsemen is a black horse, which we've identified as capitalism. The third horse will alternately, in Zechariah and Revelation, they take different places. The black and the red horse are interchangeable, but the red horse is communism. And then the fourth horse, which was called a grizzled and bay horse in the book of Zechariah, is called a pale horse in the King James Version, but in the Greek language it's called chloros, which is a green horse. So the green horse, the fourth horse, is Islam, and we've got a lot to say about that, and we won't deal with all four of these horses in this program, but I'm going to talk at length about the Catholic Church for a little while, and I hope you'll stay with me, because at the end of this program you're going to see and understand that there are some shocking things going on in Rome right now, and it involves the White House of the United States. In fact, today, the last 2 days, we've had our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has been over there. One of the major media representatives there was Sebastian Gorka. And at the same time, our Attorney General, William Barr, has also been in Rome. They've been meeting with the Pope. And it's just too coincidental. It's just too coincidental. There's got to be some connection between this bust at the Vatican Bank and the presence of Mike Pompeo and the Attorney General William Barr and some of these others. There's other figures over there, and I won't get into all of that. But I'm going to go back to another article here from the Malaysia Mail. The headline said, Vatican police raid the top offices and take documents. Vatican police raided the offices of the Holy See's Secretariat of State and its Financial Information Authority on Tuesday and took away documents and electronic devices, a statement said. That operation is highly unusual because the Secretary of State is the nerve center of the Vatican bureaucracy and diplomacy. And I want to just speculate on this at the outset and say this is just really too weird that the Vatican is busting itself. It's like the Vatican is arresting itself, or the Vatican's investigating itself. There's not a lot of logic. If you get really down to the nitty-gritty, there's not a lot of logic in the Vatican busting its own bank. I mean, for heaven's sake, the bank is its most intimate member of all that it has. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. Something fishy, something very suspicious, something very strange, something very suspect is going on. The Vatican statement gave no details except to say the operation was a follow-up on complaints filed in the summer by the Vatican Bank and the Officer of the Auditor General. A senior Vatican source said he believed the operation had been authorized by Vatican prosecutors, had to do with real estate transactions. The statement said superiors of the departments had been informed of the operation. But I want to reference tonight a man named Leo Sagami. Leo Sagami, Leozagami. Leo Sagami is a Vatican insider. He has done some expose stuff. I think of him in similar terms as the late Malachi Martin. Malachi Martin was at one time a Jesuit priest in the Roman Catholic Church, but he wrote several books in his old age that really have revealed a lot of the shenanigans and a lot of the dirty dealings inside the Vatican, and for that he met an untimely death. But this man, Leo Sagami, has got a lot of inside information on what's going on in the Vatican. He lives in Italy, lives in Rome, and he has a major website, and he covers a lot of these things and gives some pretty valuable insights to what's going on. And he just did an article on the 1st of October, which was the day of this raid, and the title of his article is Money Laundering and Mafia Infiltration Push Vatican Prosecutors to conduct a raid on the Vatican Secretary of State offices. Money laundering, get that, and mafia infiltration is what has provoked him. He said, while Pope Francis met with Father James Martin, Society of Jesuits, in a private audience in the Apostolic Palace inside the Vatican yesterday, where Martin shared, quote, the joys and hopes and the griefs and anxieties of LGBT Catholics and LGBT people worldwide, end quote. Something sinister was about to happen behind the Vatican walls. Earlier today, that is the 1st of October, Vatican prosecutors seized documents and electronic devices in a raid executed this morning at the offices of the most senior curial department in an attempt to cover up some shady deals made with the Italian mob, as outlined in some of my previous articles. According to a statement from the Holy See press office of October the 1st, the raid in question was conducted at the offices of the General Affairs section of the Secretary of State. This unprecedented action was authorized by Vatican City's court promoter of justice, Gian Piero Milano, and adjunct promoter of justice, Alessandro Didi. The documents and devices that are taken in conjunction to this investigation following complaints brought last summer by the Institute for Religious Works, that is the Vatican Bank, and the Office of the Auditor General concerning a series of financial transactions carried out over time, the statement said. This shocking news seems connected with a money laundering operation carried out by the infamous Cosa Unica, which is the new Cosa Nostra, that has united the once rivals, the Sicilian and Calabrese mafia, known as the 'Ndrangheta. In the meantime, the Italian journalist Gianluigi Nucci, who was put on trial by the Vatican for divulging confidential documents, is now coming out with a new book promising to reveal fresh secrets on the Vatican Bank. Nucci, who is a gatekeeper who has always been working in secret as an undercover Jesuit agent, said Bergoglio is busy fighting and driving merchants out of the temple. Now, I've been following the Roman Catholic Church for decades, and I'm going to tell you something. You have to read between the lines because they speak in double speak. And you'll find out you'll never get a whole story from the Vatican press office. You're never going to get it from L'Observatore, which is their official newspaper or their official website. They're only going to give you a second's worth of headline blurbs, just a clip. So you're not going to get any real information from the Catholic Church. And even when they allow so-called whistleblowers to tell the story, usually these Catholic whistleblowers are insiders too. Some of these insiders are still working undercover for the Jesuits. And you have to understand the Jesuits, the very meaning of Jesuitry in the dictionary is synonymous with casuistry or deception. From the beginning of the Jesuit organization, the Society of Jesus, in the 1500s, when it was organized in 1520 by Ignatius de Loyola, it was to be the Pope's private army, and as it were, the Pope's stealth army, the Pope's Secret Service, the Pope's CIA, as it were, and the Pope's hit squad. And you'll see throughout history, there's plenty of examples when the Jesuits were indeed the Pope's hit squad. And so anytime you see the Jesuits in the headlines, you better suspect some dirty dealings. And there's a great connection. Anybody that studies the Catholic Church knows that there's a powerful symbiosis between the Roman Catholic Church and the Italian mafias, and the Roman Catholic Church and the world money system, the Roman Catholic Church, and pretty much all the major governments of the world, including the United Nations. And so you can't hardly trust any kind of official news from the Roman Catholic Church. You have to do your homework. You have to study deep in this stuff. And I'm still reminding you that I'm talking about Bible prophecies here tonight. I want you to know and understand the Catholic Church is up to no good, and they're about to fulfill some of the biggest prophecy headlines we've ever heard. This guy Nucci said so many documents, so many interviews, journeys, insights, inspections to reveal what happens in the sacred buildings where there is a Pope, Francis, who is busy day after day fighting and driving out the merchants from the temple. Now that's a pretty flimsy defense of the Pope, I'll tell you that. To claim that the Pope is driving the merchants out of the temple is laughable. And this writer here, Leo Sagami, says, should we believe this guy Nucci? Of course not. This guy is part of the problem and is a trusted agent of the infamous Jesuits. In the meantime, the Secretary of State, that is the central governing office of the Catholic Church, and the Department of the Roman Curia, which works closely with the Pope, is in turmoil today after the raid conducted at the offices of the General Affairs section of the Secretary of State, responsible for the governance of the Vatican City State. Now, remind you, the Vatican, the Holy See is a government. It's an independent nation in the world. It is a sovereign kingdom ruled and reigned over by the Pope, and technically speaking, by the Black Pope. The Black Pope, who works behind the scene as the head of the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, is actually in charge of the White Pope, which is the Pope we all know as Pope Francis and his predecessors. So here, since the promulgation of the encyclical Pastor Bonus, written by Pope John Paul II in 1988, it spoke of the apostolic constitution governing the organization and the responsibilities of the Roman Curia. The Secretary of State has been divided into two sections, the sections for general affairs and the sections for relations with states. Now, that's an international working organization. The deputy, or the substituto, who must be a bishop, acts as the head of the section for general affairs with responsibility for the day-to-day administration of the governance of the Vatican City, and he handles all business not assigned to other curial departments. It also provides direct daily staffing service of the Pope, including overseeing the facilitation of appointments within the Roman Curia, and manages relations with all foreign ambassadors accredited to the Holy See. As of November 2017, Pope Francis established a third section of the Secretariat specifically to oversee the Vatican's diplomatic corps stationed around the world. And I remind you that the Pope has, as it were, ambassadors and, as it were, embassies in just about every nation of the world. Now, the Vatican doesn't call them ambassadors, and it doesn't call their buildings embassies. It calls them nuncios and a nunciature. So these ambassadors are called nuncios, but the point is, we have ambassadors from the Roman Catholic Church in virtually every significant nation in the world. It was in Ronald Reagan's days, back in the late 1980s, when Ronald Reagan allowed the Catholic Church for the first time in modern times to establish its own nuncio in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, the Vatican didn't have a nuncio there, although they worked in their other political operatives in Washington, D.C. They finally got an official nuncio there. So there is a official government liaison between the Vatican and Washington, D.C., between the Pope and the President of the United States. And there's a big reason for that, is because the Catholic Church has a whole lot of say in the future of the United States government. And I'm going to move on to another article by this same guy, Leo Sagami. The title of this article is Spies, listen carefully, Spies, Secrets, and the Art of the Deal. Now that's talking about Trump's deal. Spies, Secrets, and the Art of the Deal today in Rome to avoid Trump's impeachment. Listen carefully. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited the Vatican earlier today to preside over a symposium sponsored by the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See. But there's a lot more going on in Rome behind the scenes than a symposium. Of course, Pompeo did an excellent job speaking this morning at that symposium, which focused on areas of collaboration between the United States and the Vatican, including the causes of advancing religious freedoms, fighting against human trafficking. Pompeo denounced authoritarian regimes and autocrats. He named Cuba, Iran, China, and Syria as roots of religious repression because they failed to acknowledge a power higher than their own. And Pompeo, who diplomatically avoided mentioning Venezuela and Maduro, who is protected by the Jesuit Pope, declared, when the state rules absolutely, God becomes an absolute threat to that authority, and human dignity is trampled and moral norms are crushed completely. However, Sagami says, the main reason for Mike Pompeo's visit to the Vatican was mainly connected to the raid I reported on yesterday that was conducted by the Vatican police on the Secretariat of State and Finance Watchdog offices. The shocking news was initially broken yesterday by the Holy See's press office. In effect, or let me say, denunciations presented at the beginning of last summer by the Institute for the Works of Religion and the Officer of the Auditor General were the cause of it. The Institute for the Works of Religion, commonly called the Vatican Bank, is a privately held financial institution inside the Vatican. Founded in 1942, the IOR's role is to safeguard and administer property intended for works of religion or charity, but it has also been used for decades by other entities like the CIA to finance black ops against communism or criminal organizations or for money laundering. One of the world's greatest physical powers, this sovereign mini-state of 109 acres called the Vatican has investments in every sector of the Italian economy as well as abroad, and because the Vatican is not subject to Italy's stringent currency regulations, the Vatican Bank has been able to move huge sums of money throughout the international banking system for decades while eluding auditors and the like. In effect, the Vatican Bank operates in a sort of fiscal twilight zone, immune to outside interference in a manner similar to an offshore bank based on some faraway island. I wrote in a previous article, the Council of Europe's financial evaluation arm called Moneyval moved against the Vatican Bank in 2015, telling the rather unholy financiers who had been accused of money laundering for years that it isn't enough just to smoke out suspicious account holders or freeze assets, that they need to do something more to avoid being exposed and isolated from the rest of the world. Moneyval said they would start prosecuting criminal cases at the Vatican. But could this really happen when it touches on the national security of the United States? No, of course not. And that's why we go inevitably towards what our president calls the art of the deal. I want you to listen carefully. I've got some big news here. Robert Muller, as the same one that just did the investigation of Trump and the Russian collusion story. Robert Muller, a man named Joseph Mifsud, M-I-F-S-U-D, and Stephen Rowe, R-O-H, are all agents, listen carefully, of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Robert Muller is a member of the Knights of Malta and as such is under the command of the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church and under the command of the Black Pope in the Society of the Jesuits. And they have been working, listen carefully, they've been working 24/7 to overthrow Donald J. Trump using illegal means. And Trump knows it. Folks, I'm dropping bombs on you right now. The Vatican is behind the impeachment process. The Vatican is behind the effort to destroy Donald Trump's presidency, and I can tell you the simple reason why. Donald Trump is not beholden to the Roman Catholic Church. Donald Trump is not a Jesuit. Donald Trump is not a globalist. He's not a member of the Society of Jesus. He doesn't cooperate with them. He wants a free and sovereign United States of America, and he does not want global socialism, Catholicism, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism. Pope Francis and Donald Trump are the exact antithesis to each other. For this reason, something is being clearly worked out behind the scenes in Rome and in the Vatican in the last few hours to avoid further problems and possibly turn around the increasingly annoying Muller 2.2, which is born out of the idiotic Ukraine affair. We all know that impeachment is a political affair, not a legal one, said Jan Teschwan, an analyst with the German Marshall Fund in Berlin, pointed out a few days ago. So how do we sort out this mess? Well, the Knights of Malta might have a central role to play in this. As my regular readers know, I reported a year and a half ago that Pope Francis has taken over the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, commonly referred to as the Knights of Malta. Now, there's a lot of other details I could give you here that would certainly be interesting, but I want to stay with the intent of this broadcast to talk about the purpose of Bible prophecies. Now, just based on the few details I've given you here already, to show you that the Jesuits of the Roman Catholic Church do not like the Trump administration for the simple reason that the Trump administration does not cooperate with the Jesuit plan for global dominance. And you got to believe that this entire process. The fact of the matter is, just about everybody in Washington is beholden to the Roman Catholic Church. We've got 5 of our Supreme Court justices that are Roman Catholics, including Roberts, who is the Supreme Court, the head of the Supreme Court Justice, and he is beholden to the Roman Catholic Church. You've got Catholics all through Congress and Senate. You've got Nancy Pelosi. You've got just about everybody you can think of. I mean, I can name Catholics in the Congress halls all day long, and these are all, and not the least one is Adam Schiff, and just go name all these troublemakers, and you're going to find Catholics all among them. They're taking their orders from their Jesuit masters. Many of them are members of the Knights of Malta, answerable to the Black Pope. Now, you need to understand that the Bible tells us that the Catholic Church is going to rule the world before Jesus returns. And the biggest method by which the Catholic Church will indeed rule the world is through the 13th chapter of Revelation, the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast. The mark of the beast is owned and operated by the Roman Catholic Church. And it is through the mark of the beast that the Catholic Church is going to take dominion of the world economy, and is going to, in effect, dissolve the sovereignty of nations and impose an end-time world government. Now, I want you to understand this. Now, I'm a patriot. I'm an American citizen. I love my country. I love my president. I love our freedoms. I love the Constitution of the United States. And I'm a Christian. I love the Bible. I love God. I love Jesus Christ. I love the gospel plan. And I believe in all those things. But I'm going to tell you something. Freedom's days are numbered, because the Bible tells us there's going to be a world government in the last days. I'm going to go to my book, The Daniel Prophecies, and I want to some stuff from page 241 in the Daniel Prophecies. Now, before I do, I just want to tell you something about this book. I wrote a book that was probably 300 pages long prior to the year 2000, because for the last 30-something years, I have been heavily engaged in investigating all the prophecies of the Bible. I've written a 1,400-page book here that's got 1,200 lessons. This Daily Bible Companion has 1,200 lessons where I combed through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation and combed out every prophecy that I could find in the entire Bible and wrote lessons on them. Then I came behind that, and after having written another book that I did not publish earlier of almost 300 pages, I put another 4,000 hours into writing the Daniel prophecies. There's 30 years and 4,000 years of writing and editing in this book, and chapter 7 of this book is about 400 pages of expose against the Roman Catholic Church, and to tell you and show you and explain to you exactly what the Catholic Church is going to be and what the Catholic Church is going to do in the last days, and how God Almighty is going to judge it before Jesus comes at the second coming. So when you see the Catholic Church moving to take over the world, as it's doing right now, and when you see people like Donald Trump and freedom-loving patriots in the United States having to effectively go to war against the Roman Catholic Church to fight for the survival of our presidency, then you know that this Catholic Church is everything the Bible said it would be. The Pope of the Roman Catholic Church is the second beast of Revelation chapter 13. He is the lamb that speaks like a dragon. And that Pope of the Roman Catholic Church is the one that's going to announce the mark of the beast and cause all, both rich and poor, free, great and small, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark that no man might buy or sell save he take the mark or the name or the number of his name of that Catholic Church. So I'm going to go to this, and if you'll stay with me, you're going to learn something really big here tonight. This comes from page 241 in the Daniel's Prophecies, which subtitled God's Plan for the Last Days. And I'm talking about the church banking connection. And I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church and its connection to the international banking system. I want to explain how the white horse and the black horse are both servants of the spirit of Rome. In fact, before I finish this series, you're going to see that all 4 of the horsemen of prophecy are ruled by the spirit of Rome. In the second chapter of Daniel, you see an image that had a golden head, which was the Babylonian Empire. It had a silver breast and arms that represented the Medo-Persian Empire that followed the Babylonians. Then next was the brass thighs of the Grecian Empire that followed, and then the iron legs and the iron and clay feet that go all the way till the second coming of Jesus. When you read how that stone hewn out of a mountain was destroyed by the iron legs and iron and clay feet of that image, that's the second coming of Jesus Christ and his destruction of the Roman Catholic global government in the last days. Jesus is going to destroy the iron and clay, which is Roman Catholic Europe. It's the political and religious system of the Catholics in Europe. Catholicism is a global arm of the spirit of Rome. Those iron legs represents the demon spirit of Rome, which is the most powerful demon spirit in the world to this day, and it will continue to be in power until Jesus comes and overthrows that demon Roman spirit. But the Roman spirit not only rules over the Catholic Church, it also rules over capitalism. It also rules over communism, and I'll show that in future lessons. It also rules over Islam, and I'll show you that later on when we get to it. But for now, I just want to show you how the Jesuits rule capitalism. According to the late author Averell Manhattan in a 1983 book called Vatican Billions, he said the Vatican has large investments with the Rothschilds of Britain and France and America. The Vatican has investments with the Hambros Bank, with the Credit Suisse in London and Zurich. In the United States, the Vatican has large investments with the Morgan Bank, the Chase Manhattan Bank, the First National Bank of New York, which is now Citibank, the Bankers Trust Company, which is now Deutsche Bank, which has a lot of scandals associated with it. And the Vatican has billions of shares in the most powerful international corporations like Gulf Oil, Shell, General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, General Electric, International Business Machines, TWA, etc. Now, this is 1983. Some idea of the real estate and other forms of wealth controlled by the Catholic Church may be gathered by the remark of a member of the New York Catholic Conference. Namely, he said that his church probably ranks second only to the United States government in total annual purchases. Another statement made by a nationally syndicated Catholic priest perhaps is even more telling. He said, the Catholic Church must be the biggest corporation in the United States. We have a branch office in every neighborhood. Our assets and real estate holdings must exceed those of Standard Oil, AT&T, and U.S. Steel combined. Our roster of dues-paying members must be second only to the tax rolls of the United States government. The Catholic Church, once all her assets have been put together, is the most formidable stockbroker in the world. The Vatican, independently of each successive pope, has been increasingly oriented toward the United States. The Wall Street Journal said that the Vatican's financial deals in the United States alone were so big that very often it bought or sold gold in lots of $1 million or more at once. Now, this is in 1983. The Vatican's treasure of solid gold has been estimated by the United Nations World Magazine to amount to several $1 billion in 1983. A large bulk of this is stored in gold ingots within the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, while banks in England and Switzerland hold the rest. But this is just a small portion of the wealth of the Vatican, which in the U.S. alone is greater than that of the 5 wealthiest giant corporations of the country. When to that is added all the real estate property and the stocks and shares abroad, then the staggering accumulation of the wealth of the Catholic Church becomes so formidable as to defy any rational assessment. The Catholic Church is the biggest financial power, wealth accumulator, and property owner in existence. She is a greater possessor of material riches than any other single institution, corporation, bank, giant trust, government, or state of the whole globe. The Pope as the visible ruler of this immense amassment of wealth, is consequently the richest individual of the 20th century. No one can realistically assess how much the Pope is worth in terms of billions of dollars. The Economist magazine reported August 12, 2012, that the Catholic Church is as big as any company in America. Its 2010 spending was estimated at $170 billion. It employs over 1 million people. And as I've shown before, the inestimable wealth of the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican Treasury as it is called, was controlled by the Jesuits since the 1500s and was placed into the safekeeping of the Jewish Rothschild dynasty in 1824 when they officially became what was called the guardians of the Vatican Treasury. Following the commencement of the Rothschilds' management of the Vatican Treasury, the international banking system experienced explosive growth as the wealth of the Vatican was put to usury in banks and stock markets all over Europe and eventually around the world. That wealth has not disappeared. It did not vanish into thin air. The Catholic Church is not broke. It's wealthier now than it has ever been. It may not be traceable. Undoubtedly, much of the wealth is untraceable. It's stashed away in offshore accounts. It's laundered through every imaginable venue with the help of the mafia and drug cartels. Billions, perhaps trillions of dollars of invisible money circle the globe daily under the auspices of the Catholic Church. But the most disturbing of all facts about the Vatican pertains to its control and manipulation of the world's central banks and stock markets. Did you get that? Central banks and stock markets are controlled in very large part by the Jesuits of the Catholic Church. That should greatly disturb you. That should greatly disturb the whole world. Now I want to talk to you about the Federal Reserve and the coming economic collapse. It's prophesied. The United States Federal Reserve Bank, which is neither federal nor reserve, is the New World Order's noose around America's neck. More exactly, it is the Jesuits' noose around its neck. Donald Trump knows that. Donald Trump knows that while he has built one of the most robust economies in the history of this country, the Federal Reserve is doing everything it can right now to ruin our economy and ruin Donald Trump's hopes for another election. The Fed is the iron fist of Big Brother in the United States. It belongs not to the United States government, but to private parties, a vast percentage of which is traceable back to the investments of the Vatican Treasury and the Rothschild banking system centuries ago. The Fed is in very large part owned by the Jesuits. You should know that every sovereign government has the full authority to print and issue its own currency. Ideally, any government should be able to raise money by taxation and by issuing currency on its own good faith and credit. In a proper economic system, a government prints its own money and spends it into the economy. It hires and pays for its own infrastructure. It builds highways and bridges and government buildings and educational institutions and etc. Sometimes it lends to its people. The government puts debt-free currency into circulation. But in a Jesuit Rothschild banking system, we now have the government does not print its own currency. Bankers print our currency and loan it to us at interest. Ask yourself, should we print our own money at virtually no cost? Or should we borrow every single dollar that we spend from people who do nothing but print paper money and loan it to us at interest? That's what's happening. Thomas Jefferson said, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already, they've raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power of money should be taken away from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." That's what Jefferson said. It's certifiably insane to give private parties the right to print and issue paper money and then as a loan when we could be printing and issuing our own currency at virtually no cost whatsoever. The so-called $100 trillion debt the United States now owes would be completely zero if we had printed our own money instead. We could have balanced our own budget instead of borrowing. Intelligent men have always known that. The Bible says in Proverbs, the rich ruleth over the poor. The borrower is servant to the lender. Proverbs 22:7. One of the bitter feuds between the original 13 American colonies and King George III of England was embroiled over the colonists' right to issue their own currency. The Bank of England had a noose around the colonies' necks. By 1755, all 13 of the colonies began printing their own paper money. In 1757, they called it colonial scrip. It was a debt-free fiat money, which means paper money, not based on coin, metal, or other redeemables. Benjamin Franklin described it. He said, in the colonies, we issue our own money. It's called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportions to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money. We control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay, no one. But King George III of England was not pleased. He wanted them to use the Bank of England. His Currency Act of 1764 demanded that colonies cease issuing their own currencies as legal tender for public or private debts. But the colonies stubbornly objected, and in 1773 the British Parliament yielded to their arguments and allowed them to print their own currencies. The Continental Congress created a federal continental currency to help pay for the American Revolutionary War against Britain. But when the war dragged on from 1775 to 1783, they printed far more currency than their taxation could support, so the value of their continental dollar collapsed and inflation ensued. But in 1788, the Constitutional Convention ratified the U.S. Constitution, and it denied the individual states' right to print money. Subsequently, in 1791, the Rothschilds won a major coup when their agent and proxy, President Alexander Hamilton, negotiated to move the nation's capital to Washington, D.C. in exchange for the South's support of a central bank set up by its close ties, the Rothschilds. As a consequence, on April 25, 1791, George Washington signed a bill that created the first Bank of the United States. It was a central bank with a 20-year charter. But public outcry against that central bank was severe. Thomas Jefferson strongly resisted renewing the bank bill in 1809. He said, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from these banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. As a result, that bank's charter was not renewed when it expired in 1811. But predictably, the bankers were furious, and that provoked the War of 1812. At the prodding of the European bankers, the British Army invaded and burned Washington, D.C., and would have taken back our country. But the Americans won crucial victories in New York and at New Orleans. But in 1816, the bankers won another round when the Second Bank of the United States was established with another 20-year charter. It was a fight to the death between the elite bankers and the prudent American people. But President Andrew Jackson was entirely lucid about the evils of the central bank, and he swore to drive out the central bankers. Jackson vehemently declared that only the Congress of the United States had the constitutional power to regulate currency, and it was not to be transferred to a corporation, he said. He clearly articulated the inherent dangers of foreign investors controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence. That would be more formidable and dangerous than a military power of the enemy. In February of 1834, as the second bank's 20-year charter neared its expiration date, President Andrew Jackson told a committee of citizens in Philadelphia, "Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I've had men watching you for a long time. You're a den of vipers and thieves. I have determined to rout you out. And by the eternal," bringing his fist down on the table, he said, "I will rout you out." But nevertheless, the Jesuit Rothschild lobby worked devilishly behind the scenes, and in the end, both the House and the Senate of the United States approved the bank's new charter. But President Jackson resolutely and defiantly vetoed it, and he made it his re-election issue. In his campaign for a second presidential term in 1832, Jackson's campaign slogan was, "Jackson and no bank." And he won. That sounds like Trump. For his relentless opposition to the central bank powers, however, Jackson was the victim of an assassination attempt in broad daylight. A would-be assassin with 2 pistols shot, but both weapons inexplicably misfired. Thank God. Jackson later told Martin Van Buren, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I'll kill it." And he did. The charter of that second bank expired in 1836, and the U.S. was without a central bank until 1913. Abraham Lincoln was keen to the diabolical threats against America that were posed by the Roman Catholic Jesuits and by Illuminism and by Freemasonry and by the central banks, and he fought courageously against them. But that was not the only thing that Abraham Lincoln knew could destroy America. Lincoln knew the evils and dangers of the Rothschild bankers. Lincoln said the government should create, issue, and circulate all currency and credits needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be master and become the servant of humanity. During Abraham Lincoln's first term in 1862 and then in 1863, the Congress passed what was called legal tender laws that authorized the U.S. government to create fiat paper money and forcing creditors to accept such currency. Lincoln created a national bank infrastructure by the National Bank Acts of 1863 and 64. And state banks, of which there were thousands, were forced to use the national currency issued by the U.S. Treasury. Lincoln created a paper currency for our country. He printed it in green on the backside, which came to be known as greenbacks. But naturally, the global bankers furiously hated the greenbacks, and they were not to be defeated. They put a bullet through Lincoln's head, and they renewed their efforts to create their central bank. And finally, in 1910, at a maximum secret conclave at a lush resort on Jekyll Island, Georgia. You ought to go see that. Jekyll Island, Georgia, is where the sinister banking operatives conspired to force upon the United States Congress another central bank. Years later, the New York Times on May the 3rd, 1931 said 1/6 of the total wealth of the world was represented by the members of the Jekyll Island Club. Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was the maternal grandfather of the Rockefellers, Frank Vanderlip of National City, now Citibank, Henry P. Davidson of Morgan Bank, J.P. Morgan's personal attaché, and Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Investment House. These men conspired to create a scientific currency system for the United States. It was a Jesuit Rothschild currency. Their scheme was championed to President Woodrow Wilson by Colonel Edward Mandell House. Colonel House, who once described himself as a Marxist socialist, but whose actions more reflected Fabian socialism, was the author of a 1912 book entitled Philip Drew, Administrator. In that book, House described a conspiracy within the United States with the goals of establishing a central bank, a graduated income tax, and control of both political parties. 2 years after the publication of his book, 2 if not 3 of his literary goals had already been met in reality. Colonel House was Wilson's trusted confidant who convinced him to approve the new version of the Aldrich Bill, which led to the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. And at last, in 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, and President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Bank into existence. Before he retired, Wilson mournfully admitted, "I have unwittingly destroyed my country." So who really owns the Federal Reserve Bank? Consider the Rothschild Bank of London, the Warburg Bank of Hamburg, the Rothschild Bank of Berlin, the Lehman Brothers of New York, the Lazard Brothers of Paris, Kuhn Loeb Bank of New York, Israel Moses Seif Banks of Italy, Goldman Sachs of New York, the Warburg Bank of Amsterdam, the Chase Manhattan Bank of New York, and others. This is a privately held. I'm talking about the Federal Reserve. If all the hidden truth could be documented and exposed, we would discover a long money trail all the way back to the old Vatican Treasury. These banks have clearly identifiable connections to the Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds have for more than 2 centuries operated as proxies for the Jesuit masters who made them the guardians of the Vatican Treasury. These are old money banks, old as in Vatican old, counting countless billions, if not trillions, of mostly untraceable Vatican money. Theirs is the old money that built the first European shipping and railway empires, the American oil companies, monopolies, the auto manufacturers, and that financed the Industrial Revolution. Vatican money did that. Theirs is the old money that built kings' palaces and state houses and mind-blowing Rothschild estates all over Europe. Their money predates modern banks and bankers. They are spiritual descendants of the despicable money changers that Jesus drove out of the holy temple in Matthew 21 and Mark 11. These are the men to whom Jesus prophesied, "Woe unto you that are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe unto you that are full, for you shall hunger." Luke 6:24 and 5. They're the men to whom James prophesied, saying, "Go to now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. You have heaped treasure together for the last days. Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you, kept back by fraud, crieth, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived in pleasure on this earth and been wanton. You have nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter. You've condemned and killed the just." That's what James 5:1-6 says. But I want you to remember that Jesuits operate by stealth. I'm talking about stealth wealth. They'll deny it to the death that they're up to any no good, smiling for the cameras in their tidy black cassocks. But centuries of bloody, torturous inquisitions, crusades, senseless wars, assassinations, political corruptions, financial intrigues, and millions, 100 million corpses left in their past prove they are up to no good, and they stealthily handle their money just as deviously. Who on earth can uncover the massive wealth of the Roman Catholic Church? Who on earth can know how many giant banks and investment firms are owned, operated, and underwritten by the Vatican? Deposits in nearly every nation on earth and every island of the sea, in offshore accounts and investment havens. Who, tell me, can force them out in the open? Nobody but God. Absolutely no one. The only thing we can trace is footprints and fingerprints. But there are plenty of them, and they are especially plentiful among the banks, stock markets, investment firms, political hubs, elite power centers, and boiler rooms around the world. The complete history of the Jesuit Rothschild banking system is far too extensive and too clandestine for me to document it here and now, but by now you should be able to see the modus operandi of their hellish global banking octopus. The banks forced their way into nation states where they were routinely hated and opposed. Harsh measures were implemented to silence the objections until the banks were firmly established and no one could resist or overthrow them. Money changers manipulated the people, expanding and contracting money supplies, raising and lowering interest rates, creating booms and busts, inflation and deflation, bull markets and bear markets, roaring 20s followed by Great Depressions. They are heartless, demon-possessed tyrants ruling over their hated and despised slaves like a drug pusher, violently extorting money from a helpless heroin addict simply for another dollar to put in his pocket, like a cold-blooded hitman working for a dreaded mafia don. James Madison said, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuances." Henry Ford said, "It is well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." President James Garfield said, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." President Woodrow Wilson said, "A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated in the hands of a few men. We've come to be one of the worst ruled and one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and vote of majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." In his book entitled Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, Professor Carroll Quigley of Georgetown University, which by the way is a Jesuit institute, explained exactly how the international financiers of the world created a system of financial control that's able to dominate the political systems of all countries through their central banks. The Fed is America's central bank. In Britain, it's the Bank of England. All nations have a central bank owned and operated by a secretive and unidentified international cartel. The chairman of each central bank is the mouthpiece for the international bankers who control the world and the nations. In America, that man was for many years Alan Greenspan. Then it was Ben Bernanke. Even as I wrote the script for this, it was Janet Yellen, a Keynesian economist, and we've seen a couple of others since then. They have just been confirmed in congressional hearings to be the next chair. But Carroll Quigley explained the connection between those individuals who chair the central banks to their owners. Listen carefully. He said, "It must not be felt that those heads of the world's chief central banks were themselves substantive powers. They were not. Rather, they were technicians and agents of the dominant investment bankers of their own countries who had raised them up and were perfectly capable of throwing them down. The substantive financial powers of the world were in the hands of these investment bankers who remained largely behind the scenes in their own unincorporated private banks. These formed a system of international cooperation and national dominance that was more private and more powerful and more secret than that of all their agents in the central banks." The fact that Carroll Quigley spoke from the vantage point of a Jesuit insider should signal to us who really rules the world's finances. If you drill deep enough into the history of the central banking institutions, you'll most certainly find the Rothschilds. But behind the Rothschilds, you will find Jesuits and other Catholics, Masons, and Illuminati types strategically placed throughout the entire network and infrastructure. And you will find that the gargantuan percentage of all the wealth bears both a Vatican watermark and a Luciferian spirituality. Most people cannot imagine and would be utterly dumbfounded and aghast if they knew what a deadly stranglehold Jesuit Catholics have on international politics and finance via academicians, diplomats, espionage agents ever since the Federal Reserve Act was passed through Congress during the Christmas of 1913 by high-powered Jesuit and Rothschild-connected bankers. The United States of America has been a slave, a puppet, and pawn of this Jesuit-controlled international banking cartel. Most people are oblivious to the existence of the deadly Jesuit Rothschild global shadow government operating in America and in the nations of the world at large. Whether in ignorance or in denial, they cannot speak of it in anything but ambiguous, nondescript terms. They have never seen a clear image of Big Brother, only a blurry-eyed, foggy concept. But let me tell you that Big Brother is real, he is tangible, he is formidable and terrifying government that is run by very real and very evil people. He pulls the strings not only in America, but also in the entire global economic, political, and religious communities. It was the very same people who foisted the Federal Reserve Bank on the United States in 1913 who also created the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Council of Foreign Relations, the CFR, the League of Nations. 7 years later at the Paris Peace Conference, which concluded World War I, U.S. President Wilson and his alter ego, Colonel House, gave the world the League of Nations in 1919. House had met in New York in 1917 with about 100 prominent men, dubbed the Inquiry, to brainstorm globalist international solutions for World War I. Colonel House, who was a socialist and a member of Cecil Rhodes' Roundtable Group, which included J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, had written that book, Philip Drew Administrator, which is a fictional book depicting a conspiracy in the United States to establish a central bank, an income tax, and control of both political parties. The book was a virtual script and playbook for a government takeover by the central bank. And in real life, House became the mediator between those central bankers, those secret bankers who met at Jekyll Island, and the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. And it was under House's aegis that highly unpopular Federal Reserve Act was pushed into law during the Christmas holidays of 1913, while many congressmen were not even present to vote. Colonel House succeeded in creating the Federal Reserve Bank and the Internal Revenue Service. In doing so, House personally brought the fictional role of Philip Drew into real life. Colonel House continued making globalist power plays throughout the end of World War I, and in a meeting at the Majestic Hotel in Paris in May of 1919, the Colonel, with several Jesuit-handled big bankers, including Paul Warburg, who had been president at Jekyll Island and was an original member of our Federal Reserve Board, Bernard Baruch, and others, conceived the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations at the perfect time to help spawn the new League of Nations. Now I want to speak of the Bible prophecies pertaining to the four spirits, or the four horsemen, at the end of the period of World War I. This is a good place for me to remind you that I'm primarily discussing the Bible prophecies about the four spirits that vie for the souls of men in the last days. In the very instance that I've been describing to you here, you should be able to clearly see, if you look close, all four of those spirits working, even as far back as the Paris Peace Conference in 1923. At the end of World War I. Catholicism in the Jewish political operatives and powers and brokers. Capitalism was in the big bankers financing nations on both sides of the war. Communism, you had Fabian socialists at the table, economists like John Maynard Keynes and the Russian Bolsheviks, who were at the very moment overthrowing Russia with Marxism. And even Islam was at the table at the Paris Peace Conference in 1913. And I'll be talking about that more, and I'll show you how that Islam is wresting control of the Middle East in men like King Faisal of Syria back in those days. And he was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, who was the representative of the Arab Muslim delegates. I'll show you in later videos how the Jesuits influence Islam when I discuss the fourth horseman of the spirit of the last days, the green horse. It's important that you understand that where spirits are at work, there does not have to be a paper trail. Spirits, I'll remind you, are invisible and they're real. You won't see a paper trail for all their shenanigans. Spirits speak directly to the hearts of men without being recognized. Evil men with kindred spirits are guided invisibly and unaware from on high. In many cases, we address them as Satanists. We call them Luciferians. We call them occultists. We call them Freemasons. We call them Illuminati. There's a whole batch of names that we give them. They don't always have to have a human communique. They work in lockstep with demonic forces. They have kindred spirits because they are like-minded. They are like-minded because they have kindred spirits. These four Luciferic spirits, Catholicism, capitalism, communism, and Islam, are all coerced and exploited by the principal spirit of Rome, and they work endlessly, tirelessly, and ruthlessly to enslave and oppress men and to deprive them of the knowledge of the one true God and the only true plan of salvation. Theirs is Lucifer's master plan of death and destruction. The central banks actually make or break countries, governments, and societies by manipulating money supplies. Former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan admitted the power of the central bank to build and tear down national economies. In 1966, Greenspan said of the crash of 1929, he said the excess credit, listen, the excess credit the Fed pumped into the economy spilled over into the stock market, triggering a fantastic speculative boom, and as a result, the American economy collapsed. Do you see that? According to Greenspan's own admission, it was the excess credit collapsed the economy in 1929 by the Federal Reserve. So why should anyone be thrilled in these days of global economic downturns to see the Fed lowering rates again and again, promising to flood the nation with lots of cash? A flood of fiat cash does not save economies, it breaks economies. It is the proven prescription for failure. Nevertheless, central banks around the world aggressively engage in bailouts and stimulus packages and cash infusions, and it is absolute premeditated sabotage, intentionally creating either puppet states or failed states. It's difficult to imagine where we would be today without a house, mortgage, car loan, or business loan, but the sad truth is that our country literally lives on borrowed money. Remember again and never forget what the Bible says. The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Listen to me. World power is ultimately held in the hands of the wealthy elite. In 1924, Reginald McKenna, chairman of the Midland Bank, said, "I'm afraid the ordinary citizen will not like to be told that the banks can and do create money, and they who control the credit of the nation direct the policies of governments and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people." Carroll Quigley added, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in the private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of this system, listen carefully now, the apex of this system is the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. If you've not heard of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, you should look it up. It's a privately owned bank, owned and operated by the world's central banks, which are themselves private corporations. Each central bank in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank in Germany, sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. In the introduction of the book Tragedy and Hope, Michael Chadwick wrote, "There really is a world system," listen carefully, "there really is a world system of financial control in private hands that is able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world. I call this the World Trade Federation. It is an ultra-secret group of the most powerful men on earth. They now control every major international institution, every major multinational and transnational corporation, both public and private, every major domestic and international banking institution, every central bank, every nation state on earth, the natural resources on every continent, and the people around the world through complicated interlocking networks that resemble giant spider webs. This self-perpetuating group has developed an elaborate system of control that enables them to manipulate governments, leaders, consumers, and people throughout the world. They are They are right now in the last stages of developing a world empire that will rival the ancient Roman Empire. However, this new empire will rule the entire world, not just a goodly portion of it as Rome did long ago, from its ultra-secret world headquarters in Germany. This group is responsible for the death and suffering over 180 million men, women, and children. They were responsible for World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War. They have created periods of inflation and deflation to confiscate and consolidate the wealth of the world. They were responsible for the enslavement of over 2 billion people in all the communist nations of Russia, China, Eastern Europe, inasmuch as they were directly responsible for the creation of communism in these nations. They build up and sustain these evil totalitarian systems for private gain. They brought Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and Roosevelt to power and guided their governments from behind the scenes to achieve a state of plunder unparalleled in world history. They make Attila the Hun look like a kindergarten child compared to their accomplishments. For the last 2.5 centuries, wealth and power have been concentrating in the hands of fewer and fewer men and women. This wealth is now being used to construct and maintain the world empire that is in the last stages of development. The world empire is partly visible and partly invisible today. The chief architects of this new world empire are planning another war, World War III, to eliminate any vestiges of political, economic, or religious freedom from the face of the earth. They will then completely control the earth and its natural resources. These people will be completely enslaved, just as the people were in the ancient Roman Empire. While the above may sound like fiction, I assure you that it is true. I wish it was fiction, but it is not. It is reality. This is the central bank of the central banks. If the mark of the beast has an office, this is it, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. If the European beast and the Roman false prophet of Revelation 13:17 have a financial power center, this is it, the Bank for International Settlements. It answers to no government. It answers to no parliament on earth. It is run by Jesuit Rothschild Consortium. For what it's worth, Hillary Clinton comes and goes from that building quite frequently. They control the economies of every government and person on earth. If the New World Order has a financial center, this is it. The final global currency will probably be determined right in this building. This is in all likelihood the very building from which the mark of the beast will be dictated. We cannot imagine what a catastrophic scenario is right now in the making. In an article entitled "The Bank for International Settlements Calls for Global Currency," John Vion said, "When you understand that the Bank for International Settlements pulls the strings of the world's monetary systems, you then understand that they have the ability to create a financial boom or bust in a country. If that country is not doing what the money lenders want, then all they have to do is sell its currency." That article in a publication called News with Views said the Bank for International Settlements calls for a global currency. That was in 2003. In June of 2007, the Bank for International Settlements, the clearinghouse for all the nations of the world's central banks, issued a terse warning in the press. They warned that the global economy was teetering toward an economic collapse of the magnitude of the 1929 Depression, and that warning came from the arm of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Big Brother is sending a message to you and me, and they're saying to us, the system is going to fail. Are you hearing what they're telling us? If you're not hearing it, why are you not hearing it? That is its warning. An economic crisis has been carefully crafted and precisely engineered by the most powerful people in all the world over the past 500 years, and nothing is going to prevent it. Donald Trump is not going to stop it. It will trigger the great tribulation that Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24, verses 21 to 22. When President Andrew Jackson blocked the renewal of the central bankers' charter in 1811, the bankers threatened to wreak havoc on America. Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress, they said. Our central bank's only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm restriction, and I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to restoration of the currency and recharter of the bank, according to Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Second Bank of the United States. The War of 1812 was that firm restriction he was prophesying. It lasted for 2 years, and it did indeed lead to the recharter of the bank in 1816. Today, America faces a far more ominous threat than Andrew Jackson faced in 1812. Then they declared war on American soil to force them to allow them to operate a bank. But today they intend to take over the entire world. That calls for measures far more horrifying and unimaginable than the War of 1812. Big Brother wants to eliminate all its competition once and for all. The American godfather of wealth, John D. Rockefeller, infamously said, "Competition is sin." That's what one of the world's wealthiest men said. His words rang hollow, however, because he was a master of competition. He was a monopolist. So are all the modern bankers. They will eliminate or control all other banks, governments, societies, etc. Only those who fully comply with their new world order will survive after all the coming chaos has been unleashed. Only those who are enslaved to and fully compliant with this new coming mark of the beast will stand in their new world order. The worldwide arm of the Jesuit Rothschild beast is about to slam its iron fist of communism down on modern global civilization, and nothing will ever be the same as the purge violently begins. Gary Allen, who wrote None Dare Call It Conspiracy, said, if one understands that socialism is not a share of the wealth program, but it is in reality a method to consolidate and control the wealth, then the seeming paradox of super rich men promoting socialism becomes no paradox at all. Instead, it becomes logical, even to the perfect tool of power-seeking megalomania. Communism, or more accurately, socialism, is not a movement of the downtrodden masses, but of economic elite. The presence of a strong central bank guarantees that a nation will be enslaved by socialism and then by communism. The history of the French Revolution illustrates my premise. The Bank of France, which was a central bank, was established in 1800, but Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a formidable warrior and conqueror, was an anti-Jesuit, and he opposed foreign-owned central banks. Napoleon declared the hand that gives is above that hand that takes. He said money has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. But because of Napoleon's opposition to the bankers, his fate was doomed. He was a marked man. Napoleon effectively deposed the Jesuits Jacobins in France and took his French armies on conquest across Europe. But the Bank of England poured enormous amounts of money into his opponents and finally toppled Napoleon, earning a massive profit in the process. Nathan Rothschild in the Bank of England financed the Duke of Wellington against Napoleon at Waterloo. Rothschild had agents on the ground reporting back to him on the progress of the war, and Rothschild's spies secretly reported to him of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo almost a full day before the news got back to the British public. So Nathan Rothschild played a ruse in the British stock market that day by conducting a huge sell-off and pretending to be morose, intimating that he was privy to Wellington's defeat. So traders on the market floor observed Rothschild's actions and fallen demeanor, and they presumed that the British had lost the war. Investors became fearful of a crash, and they quickly sold off their holdings all day long. But before the markets closed, Rothschild quickly reversed his position and bought up all the shares that had just been dumped throughout the day at junk prices. He had known all along that Wellington had defeated Napoleon and that Britain was safe and sound. Some researchers claim that Rothschild's wealth that day grew by about 100 million British pounds in one day, and that he effectively took ownership of the Bank of England. Now that may never be proven, but from that day, Rothschild wealth evidently soared into the stratosphere. Soon after that, it was said of the Rothschilds that they owned half the world. Stealth global bankers at the heart and periphery of the Bank of England amassed unimaginable wealth, and through the Rothschild banks, Jesuits parlayed the wealth and political influence of the Roman Catholic Church, gradually conquering the world's governments and financial systems. That approaches the stated Jesuit Rothschild Illuminati goal articulated by Adam Weishaupt in 1776, which was, quote, to destroy all governments, nations, and religions, and to erect on the ruins of civilization a new world order. erect a new world order controlled by the Jesuits on the ruins of civilization. How plain does it have to be? If you have doubts about the Jesuit goals of absolute world control, consider this final commission on that is given to each and every Jesuit in his swearing-in testimony. When they swear in Jesuits, this is the final instruction given to the candidate who has taken the Jesuit oath. Listen, go ye then into all the world and take possession of all lands in the name of the Pope. He who will not accept him as the vicar of Jesus and his vice-regent on earth, let him be accursed and exterminated. That's the Jesuit oath. That evidence comes from page 124 of a book by Edwin Sherman entitled The Engineer Corps of Hell, or Rome's Sappers and Miners, published in 1883. It's also quoted in Subterranean Rome by Carlos Didier of New York in 1843, and it's in the Library of Congress, catalog card number 6643354. Another book by John Daniel entitled The Grand Design Exposed said that history shows that the Jesuits have indeed diligently pursued their avowed task of cursing and exterminating non-Catholics and taking possession of all lands. For what it's worth, the Catholic Church now owns 177 million acres of land to date. Vatican holdings around the world are more staggering. They are literally unknowable. For the unbiased researcher, history reeks of the butchery of Romanism, where whole cities and populations were unmercifully wiped out but just because they worshiped a God in a manner that was different from Roman Catholicism. Yes, the Rothschilds are the agents and proxies of inestimable wealth of the Vatican Treasury, but control and ownership is still in the hands of the Jesuits. But there's more. Jesuit rule is not merely over international banks and finance, but the Jesuits literally dominate global diplomacy as well. Anyone who desires to work in the field of international diplomacy will likely be trained at a Jesuit-run university like Georgetown, Fordham, Loyola, Xavier, Boston College, or so many others. The Jesuits have by far the largest network of institutions of higher learning anywhere else on earth. Cardinals and archbishops can be seen running the Catholic Church in dioceses worldwide, but behind the scenes, Jesuits oversee them. At the top is the Black Pope, the Superior General. Under him are assistancies presiding over a world divided into 10 regions. Under the assistancies are the provincials, and Jesuit provincials handle cardinals and archbishops. In world politics, the Vatican has the most sophisticated diplomatic corps in the entire world. Not even the United States has better. The Catholic Church has a field staff of papal envoys or nuncios or Vatican ambassadors operating in almost every country on earth. Catholic Jesuits in the United Nations, not the least of Rome's powerful diplomatic venues, is that of the Permanent Observer to the United Nations, where the Pope and his delegates speak regularly to premium audiences of kings and presidents in the United Nations podium, the only global religious figure that has such access to the plenary sessions of the United Nations General Assembly. Joseph Rossi, a Jesuit, wrote 2 books called American Catholics and the Formation of the United Nations, and another one called Uncharted Territory, the American Catholic at the United Nations, in which he documents the early powerful roles of Catholics in the formation and day-to-day operations of the United Nations. In the pre-United Nations Charter days of April 1945, Archbishop John J. Mitty organized 3 services in the San Francisco Civic Center in which 40,000 people heard Fulton Sheen, the priest of TV and radio fame, speak on the moral basis of peace. Sheen's sermon was picked up by the national media. Days later, 15,000 United Nations celebrants attended a solemn pontifical mass to hear a 1,000-voice children's choir, and Archbishop Mitty declared that by the providence of God, the conference was being held in the city of St. Francis, the saint of universal love. Catholics love the United Nations. Joseph Samuel Rossi in American Catholics and the Foundation of the United Nations provided these evidences. Mitty closely monitored and smoothed with hundreds of Catholics who were delegates from nations all over the world. Rossi documented the role of Catherine Schaefer, director of the National Catholic Welfare Office in the early days of the United Nations. She worked tirelessly to penetrate the United Nations organization structure, especially the Economic and Social Council, ECOSO, literally, and convincing United Nations officials to allow non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to gain observer status status. Subsequently, she skillfully established many Catholic NGOs inside the ECOSO and other UN agencies. Schaeffer's Catholic efforts at the United Nations in those early years set many precedents for future Catholic roles in the United Nations. Schaeffer worked to increase international Catholic leverage at the United Nations and to oppose NGO status for organizations whose tenets were contrary to the teaching and principles of the Roman Catholic Church and against the directives of the Pope. That was more than 60 years ago, but have no doubt that at the international level, inside the United Nations, Catholic Jesuits are still very hard at work, exerting the maximum influence in every venue of any significance. In 1982, the United Nations Secretary General Robert Muller reported that no less than 24 powerful Catholic NGOs operated inside the United Nations. Today there are 87 Catholic NGOs inside the UN and many more coming. Neither should you have any doubt that at the national and state and local levels, Catholic Jesuits are also hard at work in every single venue of any significance, both in and outside of governments, in the United States and in every nation on earth. You would be aghast if you knew how much. Why are these secular, historical facts biblically significant? Because the events I've described to you chronicle the activities of the four prevailing spirits of this age: Catholicism, communism, capitalism, and Islam. All four of those spirits are under the command of the Superior General of the Society of Jesus. The Black Pope, sitting at the highest echelon of power on earth, is ruled by the ancient evil spirit of Rome, who is ruled by Lucifer. These are the spirits that will precipitate 42 months of hell on earth that Jesus and the Hebrew prophets warned us about thousands of years ago. These spirits will be the perpetrators of the final solution, the Grand Inquisition, or otherwise known as the Great Tribulation, that will come upon the whole earth, spoken of by Jesus Christ in Matthew 24. The world is right now undergoing a radical revolution, exactly as the Bible forecasts. It isn't just America in trouble. The USA has been until now the last bastion of economic stability and personal freedoms. But as America goes down, and it is going down, the whole world will go down with it. We'll soon see a vastly different world than we've known. Are you prepared to see a communist Russia dominated, or communist China dominated, or communist Europe dominated global economy, while the United States crashes and burns, rendering it a humiliated, debilitated, near poverty-stricken, and starving third world nation? Like it or not, the Bible prophesies the death of the dollar. There is no alternative. The U.S. dollar will not survive the Jesuit mark of the beast. The unfolding scenario is the manifestation of the New World Order. It is the long-awaited so-called externalization of the hierarchy that was spoken of by the master occultists. It is the economic system that will demand a global identification and cashless digital currency, the mark of the beast described in Revelation 13:14. This evil banking system is the prophesied weapon that the beast, the mark of the beast, will be an economic sanction against the enemies of the beast. In a way similar to the manner that economic sanctions were imposed by a U.S.-led coalition against Saddam Hussein and the nation of Iraq from 1990 to 2003, and for decades on the nation of Iran from 1917 to this day. The New World Order will impose economic sanctions on every individual who will not willingly cooperate with a new economic system, especially Christians, because if they are wise, they will refuse to take the mark of the beast. The global banking system already practices sanctions on corporations and individuals by imposing regulations and taxation. Men and companies that do not comply with their governments or bankers are subject to harsh economic sanctions in the form of seized accounts, frozen assets, recalled loans, litigation, and much more. And their resources are dreadful. Banks spy on private citizens in behalf of Big Brother. I sat in a private closed meeting with a former Federal Reserve Bank official, and I quickly transcribed his entire one-hour lecture as he spoke of the Banking Secrecy Act of 1970. He told us how the BSA requires financial institutions to act as a spy agency for Big Brother. It's called a Currency Transactions Report, CTR, must be filed with the IRS anytime you make a cash transaction of $10,000 or more, including a daily aggregate amount at multiple branches. Negotiable instrument log will be filed with the IRS on you anytime you purchase a negotiable instrument, a money order, a cashier's check, or more for $3,000 or more. A suspicious activity report, an SAR, will be filed on you with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network anytime a customer does anything vaguely suspicious, like avoiding reporting requirements, laundering money, or suspicion of violating any laws. Officials in financial institutions face harsh penalties for failing to file these reports, huge fines and prison sentences. Customers are rarely aware they're being reported, since it's also illegal to inform the customer that they are being reported. The local bankers are often unwittingly Secret Service agencies working for our enemies, the big bankers, the government. Where is the need to know in this scenario? Who needs to know all these things about us? Only someone who wants to tightly control us and crush us. Why do they need to know all this information about our money? If we don't meet their expectations and comply with their wishes or cooperate fully with their global political, economic, and religious agenda, they're going to put constraints on us. And at the top of this list is the Roman Catholic Jesuits. Do you think I'm giving you a crazy conspiracy theory? Or is it a well-documented, thoroughly provable historical agenda of power-mad men? There's a rock-headed segment of society that either by ignorance, denial, or willful subterfuge scorns any of us who refer to an evil conspiracy to rule the world. Us so-called conservatives, like Rush Limbaugh, Jesuit-trained Catholic Bill O'Reilly, known liberals like Southern Poverty Law Center, scorning patriot movements, and some of the most articulate voices in America make mockery of anyone who believes there's a conspiracy to rule the world. But the New World Order is eminently more than any innocuous, peace-loving international fraternity of nations. It is the very beast rising up out of the sea, as depicted by the prophet John 2,000 years ago in the book of Revelation, chapter 13. It will indeed destroy all governments, nations, and religions, as the prophecy says, and it will forcefully take its place as the world's only government and religion before Jesus Christ returns. The late Walter Cronkite was a powerful, influential globalist who believed that world government is absolutely necessary to the survival of civilization. Cronkite plainly stated in his book, if we are to avoid a World War III catastrophe, a system of order, preferably a system of world government, is mandatory. The proud nations will someday see the light, and for the common good and their own survival, yield up their precious sovereignty, just as America's colonies did 2 centuries ago when we finally came to our senses and established a world executive and a parliament of nations. Thanks to the Nuremberg precedent we will already have in place, the fundamental for the third branch of government, the judiciary, in the form of an international Supreme Court. Cronkite's remarks reflect the mentality of the beast. The sovereignty of nations will vanish in a moment as nations crumble under the weight of a global economic crisis. All currencies will be canceled. Old national monetary policies will evaporate. No nation will have hegemony over others except in the International Monetary Fund terms. Every man, woman, boy, and girl will be forced to use the beast's cashless currency and forced to wear its mark. The mark of the beast will rise from the ruins of an internationally failed economy. Luciferian occultists will celebrate the new global banking system as a mystical phoenix rising from its funeral pyre. The resurrection of the lost city of Atlantis, and the completion of the ancient Tower of Babel. Dr. Ralph Barton Perry of Harvard once said, "One world government is in the making, whether we like it or not. We're moving toward a one world government." And in conclusion, friend, I'm here to tell you, that is why you and I need to come to terms with the fact that our government right now under Donald Trump is facing a formidable opposition, the likes of which are indescribable. Will Donald Trump survive for another term? I'm not going to make that call. I hope that he does, but I know what the prophecies say. The Catholic beast is going to rule the world. And whether it's in the next year or 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, it's going to happen because we're living in the last generation. The last prophetic generation that Jesus spoke of in Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 21 tells us that it began when the fig tree began to put on new leaves. That's when the nation of Israel came back into existence in 1948. We are right now in the 71st year of the last prophesied generation. That means a generation being 70 to 80 years according to Psalm 91:10. We're in the last 70 to 80 years of Bible prophecy. 71 years of those have already passed. We've got maybe 8 or 9 years left And in that period, we've got 7 years of prophecy, Daniel's 70th week that has to come to pass. What am I telling you? I'm telling you, look up. Believe the gospel. Obey the gospel. Prepare to meet God. Get your heart right with God. Repent of your sins. Acts 2:38 says, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall be filled with the Holy Ghost. You shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. For the promises unto you, your children, as many as are far off, as many as the Lord our God shall call. I'm calling you today to the gospel of Jesus Christ. All the prophecies are about to be fulfilled, and that includes the second coming of Jesus Christ. If you're not ready for Jesus coming, you better get ready and do it today. Find an apostolic, Acts 2:38, Pentecostal church. Go to that church, repent of your sins, be baptized in Jesus' name, receive the Holy Ghost, speak in other tongues, and live for God till Jesus comes. And that's my message to you tonight. Thank you for staying with me. God bless you. Please go to Amazon.com. Check out my books, the books by KEN RAGGIO. You'll see the 2-volume set, my daily Bible companion, Bible lessons from Genesis to Revelation. Please, you need to get this book. I beg you to get this book. The Daniel Prophecies, God's Plan for the Last Days. 726 pages, 175 pictures, footnotes throughout. This is the most powerful prophecy book in the world, I do believe. And I hope you get that and read it. Check it out on Amazon. Just search for Books by KEN RAGGIO. Also, if you'd like to buy my whole set of books, there's a discounted price for those of you that are interested. Follow the link below this video. Also, please support this ministry with your donations. If you want to make a donation by a digital donation by internet, please click on the link below. There's also an address if you want to mail something into the post office box. We'll take it either way. May God bless you for your support. Also, follow me on all my social networks and join me on our annual trip to the Holy Land and our annual prophecy cruises. Check out all that information at my website at kenraggio.com. And while you're there, sign up for the free daily Bible studies. God bless you. See you next time every Monday night, Thursday night, 9 p.m. Central. God bless you. Good night.